Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing the Assange trial, which, as we know, continues. The United States has been asking for the UK to extradite Assange for a while now to face charges of all the way from espionage to a whole bunch of other charges that the United States wants to level against him. Obviously, that and those charges to be laid against him in American courts. So at this point in time, the latest coming out of the trial is that the U.S. has not been granted the grounds to expand its appeal in the UK to extradite now Julian Assange from the UK to America, where, as I said, he is wanted on espionage charges. This all stems from his work with WikiLeaks, as we know, even as journalists and those who have worked even in policy making, etc. WikiLeaks was in many ways, for the lack of a better word, revolutionary and ensured transparency in many regards, though certainly there is a lot of criticism of the way WikiLeaks still operates and operated in the past as well. Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Kiely, who is a professor. She's a Lee Hills Chair in Free Press Studies at the Missouri School of Journalism at the University of Missouri. She's joining us this morning from Columbia, Missouri. Joining us from Canterbury in Kent is Dr. Gbenga Oduntan, who is an associate professor of international commercial law at the Kent Law School at the University of Kent. And joining us from Aberdeen in Scotland is Dr. Paul Arnell, who is a lecturer in law at the Robert Gordon University of Aberdeen. Paul, Gbenga, and Kathy, thank you to all three of you for taking your time out to join us today. Kathy, I'd like to start with you firstly. What do you make of the U.S. insistence on wanting Assange to be extradited to the United States? The other side of the argument here on the Assange side is that he may very well self-harm, but the lawyer in the court on the U.S. side said that that is all basically just overstated.
Yeah, you know, I'm going to defer to the lawyers on some of these legal questions. I can speak more to the question about journalism and Assange's claim of being a journalist. I do think it's not surprising, though, you know, having been a journalist for many years and covered legal cases, that the United States would be insisting on extradition of somebody that the U.S. government thinks violated its laws. That should be no surprise. I would say that is an argument that lawyers will have to have, and there's a lot of criticism of the conditions in U.S. jails and how we treat our incarcerated population. But again, that I think is something that's a broader issue than just this particular case.
Let me stick with you, Kathy, then, on the issue then of journalism. Free speech hero, or is he somebody that does need to be criticized? What are your thoughts on him?
Well, my concern with this case is that consistently Assange and his defenders, I think most recently his girlfriend, are portraying him as a journalist, and he is not a journalist. And the reason that I think journalists and advocates for journalists, which I am, should be concerned about this is we have a reputational problem. Journalism is under attack around the world. There is a global war on free speech. Journalists are under attack in your country. They're under attack in my country. They're under attack everywhere. And so when we need, as professional journalists, to make it clear what we do in order to have the right to get the information we get to share with our audience, we have to make it clear that we are responsible, trustworthy stewards of that information. And while I do think that WikiLeaks made information available that was important and needed to be exposed, it did a lot of things that were not journalistic. A professional journalist would go through this information, and many of the professional news organizations that took the WikiLeaks information did this, went through this information, called out the information that the public needed to know, and separated out private information that the public didn't need to know. We didn't need to have credit card numbers of people who worked for Hillary Clinton's campaign. Indeed. Or know what pizza place Hillary Clinton's campaign manager liked to eat at. So it's this kind of stuff. And I think trying to characterize somebody who really just dumped a lot of information out as a journalist, complicates that reputational problem that journalists have.
So Gbenga, let me bring you into the conversation then, and let's talk. You can of course comment on what Kathy there mentioned about journalism and free speech in this case when it comes to Assange. But I also wanted to then ask you about this continuing effort on the U.S. to have him extradited, and the other side, of course, the argument that he may self-harm. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you very much for having me on your show. I think that I'm a bit more on the side of the right to the freedom of speech and the right to the freedom of the press. There is a lot of debate, or there can be a debate, as to whether there is a difference between the right to free speech and the right to a free press. From the perspective of knowing and being ascertainable of what the situation of a country is, or what the situation is in relation to areas that people in power want to keep hidden, I don't make a big distinction between the two. And I'm quite clear upon the fact that Assange has been an unfortunate hostage of power. And these powers are not only US powers, but anyone who wants the kind of journalism that WikiLeaks engages in not to exist in the world. We should not be afraid of more information. We should not be afraid of more transparency. What we should be afraid of is the playing out of sheer power between countries, where the United States can hound people across the world, not just Assange. We have Snowden hiding in Russia. These are examples of very bad practice, very bad examples being laid by the principal international power. And I think it's something that is regrettable, and something which the UK is doing something about by letting this play out in the courts. And it's in our collective interest that it ends on the side of the underdog here, because it's not good for us to have it on record that someone who exposes war crimes, someone who exposes bad conduct by government should be hounded for decades and then dragged to a country where is most likely going to end up like McAfee, or like Manning, who was tortured, Manning, who was a citizen of that country. And recently, of course, we had also Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah.
There is a lot to worry for in what's going on in relation to the poor gentleman.
Paul, what do you make of this case as well, and the UK's role so far? I mean, it's certainly not in a position I imagine that it wants to be in, but do you think that the UK has done right by Assange in the sense of letting this play out in the courts, as Gbenga there mentioned?
Well, yes, thank you for having me as well. My area of expertise is extradition law, and absolutely the UK is applying the law as has been settled since 2003. And Assange was successful in his first hearing in front of the district court. And then just yesterday, further grounds of appeal were allowed by the United States. And in October this year, the United States will be allowed to appeal that decision. So the law is playing out as to be expected. There are no surprises there. I was originally surprised by the decision in January, where his extradition was blocked on the basis of his mental health. And so that was surprising. The extradition arrangements between the UK and the US are geared or presumptive of extradition. And so it will normally take place unless there's a material reason why it is not. And in the district court, that reason was held to be his likelihood of suicide, as you mentioned, Waqar. So the appeal now, if I could just continue for a moment, will now,
Sure.
One of the elements of his focus will be whether the promises now made to the United Kingdom about how it will treat Assange can prevent his being successful in carrying out a suicide.
Yeah. All right. So, Kathy, what Assange faces when he comes to the U.S., and I'm going to mention the law here, but I wanted to get your thoughts on this, again, as a free speech expert. 17 espionage charges and 1 charge of computer misuse, and these carry a maximum sentence of 175 years imprisonment. So now, I'm not going deep into the law here because I'm not an expert in law either, but as Gbenga there mentioned, it's also just simply about the precedent that is being set, and a lot of countries around the world will look towards the United States and how it would act towards Assange, and then take lesson from that almost, and how they would treat then their own respective journalists. Do you think that this is troubling then just in that prism?
Well, I think it's important, and there are organizations in this country. I totally sympathize with the idea that journalists are a check on power, absolutely, and oftentimes we do need to publish government secrets because those secrets are hiding things that the public needs to know. So I think if there is a trial, you will find that there are journalism organizations that will enter as friends of the court on certain parts of this trial. And in some ways, I think it would be healthier to have a trial and to have these issues explored in an open court than to avoid one. And many, many whistleblowers, I mean, and this is what's odd about Assange. He is kind of a hybrid. A classic whistleblower is somebody who has information. That's more like a Chelsea Manning, who has information and gives it to a journalist. And then you have that relationship between the journalist and the whistleblower, and journalists have gone to jail and gone to trial to protect those sources. Assange is more like an information broker. He didn't initially have the information. He received the information. And initially, WikiLeaks worked with journalism organizations who then vetted the information and published it. But then he decided he wanted to be a publisher himself and put unfiltered information out, which was probably not the smartest thing to do and not the most constructive thing to do. And now he's facing consequences. Now, traditionally, newspaper publishers who do that, I mean, the Washington Post, when it published all the information that led to the resignation of a president, Richard Nixon, they did so in full knowledge that the government could take action against them and might shut them down, but they were willing to risk the consequences. So that, I think, is the difference here. Are you willing to make an issue of free speech and go to court and fight it out?
Kathy there makes a good point, and as a journalist myself, and I'm sure you can appreciate this certainly even from your vantage point, that we need to really have very responsible journalism, even in today's world where we are in the midst of, till now, very much misinformation campaigns all around the world from all sides. So, and I'm not saying that what Assange gave out was misinformation, but I'm just saying that, do you think that he acted in a responsible fashion, in your opinion, and then do you think that the law then has a place in then holding him to account if the answer then is no, he was not responsible?
Thank you for that. I think that we have to make the balance between conservatism and the practicality of living in the 21st century. Journalism itself changes. It started in Western, at least in this country, from the penny press, and then you had yellow journalism, and now we have internet journalism, we have bloggers. The blurring of the lines is not only apparent, but necessary. We need a journalism for the era we live in. And there's a good reason why there's no definition, no legal definition of the word journalist out there. There's a good reason why there's no list of the exhaustive list of journals or newspapers or publishing houses that each country considers official. So I think we may be paying a bit too much attention to the fact that he is not our regular journalist paid and having a masthead and having everything done the same way in Wall Street Journal or any of the other mainstream press that we are used to have. I'm not saying, and I'm not definitely excusing bad practice. If he publishes false information, that's something that we should be worried about. If he publishes embarrassing information, such as that the U.S. U.S. officials were firing into crowds of civilians, and that's embarrassing. There's no reason why that should be privileged in any way. And yes, of course, if you publish something that a country considers maybe bad for its intelligence, well, I'm sorry, that's country. He doesn't live in America. He's not an American. Why should they be bothered? Just the same way American journalists are not bothered whether they embarrass the Nigerian president or they embarrass people from the developed world. So I think you should be able to give just as much as you take. The freedom of the Western press is such that it enters into every single country in the world as of right, whether they are at war, and publishes whatever they find, which may be embarrassing to those governments, and they should be able to take it the same way.
Paul, what are your thoughts on this from your vantage point as well? Because, you know, I wonder, what then should Assange have to fear if he is extradited to the United States? I mean, the United States, at least what we're told, is a country of law and order, right? So, I mean, you know, this will all go through a trial. So it's not like the government will immediately, you know, hand down a 175-year charge against him. I mean, this will go through a trial. So what do you think is the fear here then?
A good question. I come back to that in just a second.
Sure.
Just about the point from my colleague previously about embarrassing. I think I would agree with him on that point. But the suggestions by the Americans in their extradition request is the information published by Assange was a lot more than embarrassing, but it endangered the lives of nationals in the countries working with United States security services by producing their names, their addresses, and personal details about them that did endanger their lives and the lives of their families. And that's the gist of the extradition request to the UK. The substance of the charges of disclosing classified information was that level of detail that identified individuals. And so that you know, I think rightfully America's and every country's foreign policy that is carried out, which is unlawful under international law or immoral, should be made public. But I think the allegations against Assange go further than that. So that's the first point. The second one about his fate, and this is what the UK courts will consider as well, about under his right to a private family life, his right to a fair trial, the right to be free from torture and inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment, in relation to how he will be treated upon being extradited. And amongst those concerns are prison conditions. And there's an infamous prison in Colorado, ADX Florence, where the most serious terrorists are incarcerated in the United States. And some individuals in that establishment are placed under SAMs, or special administrative measures, which can entail 23 hours a day in solitary confinement for the rest of their natural lives, and other aspects of sensory deprivation. And so very, very serious and you know, draconian, I think, in any sense of that word, punishment. And that's what part of Assange's lawyers think that he might be facing. Now, and recently, the Americans have published an assurance or a promise that if he's extradited and if he's convicted upon trial, that he will not be subjected to those special administrative measures in a supermax prison in the United States. The Assange defense team criticize the Americans and say that those assurances can't be trusted, that it's an element of trust. It's a promise made to the UK, and that he may be subjected to those measures in any event. So he faces the possibility of a very harsh fate indeed.
All right, so we're quickly running out of time, so I just want to give a minute each to Kiely and Gbenga for final comments. Kiely, on the point of the United States and how it views Assange, right? As Gbenga mentioned, and as you well know as well, you know, what WikiLeaks did when it came to maybe what we should call war crimes and/or crimes committed in war zones, possibly on the part of the U.S. government or U.S. forces, more correctly, in places like Iraq, etc. That, you know, the revelation of that is what almost the U.S. government wants vengeance for, or revenge for. You know, they want to make an example of Assange. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I am absolutely opposed to persecuting whistleblowers. And I agree with the doctor that that embarrassing information, when it is about war crimes, should be exposed. It's wholesale exposing information that doesn't need to be reported and can actually endanger people. And even beyond what Paul talked about, I could go on, but we don't have time, but a lot of extraneous information that really caused major problems. And as a journalist, that worries me, because it means other people will come after journalists and say, we don't believe in freedom of the press anymore because you caused too much damage. We need to be responsible, and we need to prove that the free press is a vital part of democracy.
Gbenga, then the final word to you. Is it not about, do you think, making him into a hero or a villain? Is it do you think, finding that proper, just middle ground, if there is one to be found?
Thank you again. It's quite difficult to see why anyone would wish himself to have gone through what this man has gone through in the last decade. He's been banged up in the Ecuadorian embassy for many years. He comes out, he's sent to jail. Yes, he's a hero to a lot of people, I would say, to those who are on the side of transparency. And it's something that he has bought at a very expensive price. I think that what I would wish on the world is more attention to Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That provision gives us the right to freedom of opinion. It gives us the right to hold opinions and without interference, and to seek and receive and impart information. And that also extends to the right of a free press. Yeah. That is what we should keep our eyes on, and we should not let power ride roughshod over these settled principles of mankind.
We're going to leave it there at that, but we really appreciate Gbenga, Kathy, and Paul for taking their time out of their busy schedules to really, give us an overview and well-rounded discussion and understanding of this issue. Assange is controversial in many, many people's eyes. To some, he's a hero. To some, he's a villain. And to some, he's just somewhere in the middle, where they do find things to criticize him for that he has done, such as what Kathy laid out as well. That doesn't mean that all the information that was released via him, via WikiLeaks, was bad. I mean, a lot of that was extremely important information, in fact, that really, really held the U.S. government, for example, to account for its actions in places like Iraq towards innocent people. And that's very, very important, and that should not be downplayed. But nevertheless, if you're releasing private credit card information, as Kathy there said, how much have you, in fact, blurred the lines then for journalism? Is he even a journalist? That, in and of itself, as our guests are discussed too, is probably an argument that's been had ever since this case has come out. What does this mean for free speech going forward? What kind of a precedent is the U.S. setting? What kind of a precedent has the UK set by allowing this to go through the courts? Really important questions, but they need to really be discussed often, especially in journalism classes, I would think. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss the statement that Israel's Diaspora Affairs Minister made in a podcast when he was speaking to a media organization, or Jewish organization, I believe, in the United States, about American Jews and their support for Israel, and the BDS movement, as well as the BLM, Black Lives Matter movement as well. He said that, and we know that, of course, Israel has been concerned about BDS for a while now, and as well as BLM, because those two seem to sometimes unite, as well as the fact that because many people do sign on to the BLM and support that organization, that many of the times they do then speak out about any atrocities, in their eyes at least, that may be occurring in the occupied territories. Now, the issue of American Jews and their support for Israel, American Jews largely are a liberal voting group, even though, of course, I don't want to generalize and say every single American Jew does so. And by and large, I mean, the majority still very much does support Israel, seemingly, but those numbers seem to then be going down enough that there is worry now on the Israeli side as well. What does this mean going forward? We've done this sort of show before as well, where we've discussed with American Jews as well around the world and their opinions on this. And we're trying to now understand this as well in this show, and with this panel now, their opinions on this issue. We're joined now by Dr. Atalia Omer, who is a professor of religion, conflict, and peace studies at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. She's joining us this morning from South Bend, Indiana. Joining us from New York, is Dr. Hasia Diner, who is a Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History at New York University. And joining us from Northampton, Massachusetts, is Dr. Jhally, who is a Professor Emeritus at the Department of Communication at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Sat, Hasia, and Atalia, thank you to all three of you for taking your time out this morning. Atalia, I'd like to start with you. Does Israel have something to worry about when it comes to support or lack of amongst American Jews?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having this conversation. Yeah, Israel has to worry about the kind of the erosion of the support among American Jews. Of course, my research and other and recent polls show that there is a generational difference and so forth. But the worry, I think that we need to reframe the question in the sense that Israel has tried to control the narrative for so long without actually changing policies on the ground. Because in fact, many organizations that support BDS or express anti-occupation positions want to see Israel change its policies rather than to keep kind of branding or selling the same narrative about self-defense and so forth. So yes, there is something to worry about, but this worry needs to translate into changing policies on the ground.
Hasia, what are your thoughts about then policy changes? Is that the next logical then step for Israel, or do you think that, as the Israeli Diaspora Affairs Minister said, Israel in fact needs to do more vis-a-vis outreach towards American Jews?
Well, it's what they have to do is sort of in a way not the issue, but it is, in a sense, what are they going to do? What is Israel going to do? And I think Nachman Shai's position is very clear and representative, which is we're not changing anything, but we just have to come up with a better message by which to sell this. And for the most part, that has been or is a kind of dead-end policy or a dead-end strategy, because, yes, the numbers are really clear that younger American Jews in particular, but not only, are not only not buying that message, but, and here I want to tie it to the Black Lives Matter issue, I think that American Jews for the last really half century have been sort of told through synagogues and youth groups and the denominations and so on that there's an intimate connection, a deep connection between Judaism and social justice, and that to be a Jew means to be engaged with, social justice issues. Reform movement has particularly embraced this through its very active and impressive work that they define as tikkun olam. And so if that's the case, if young Jews are learning in a religious school, in their summer camps, that to be a Jew means to be pursuing social justice, and a representative of the state of Israel says, but you can't support Black Lives Matter, then they're put in a kind of crunch, a dilemma between what they've been told Judaism is and now a kind of statement, no, it's actually not that. It's really about supporting a Jewish state whose policies you are increasingly not supporting. So it's really a kind of, I'd say almost kind of paradoxical situation that people like Shai and others from the Israeli government are putting American Jews into, putting them into a conundrum. Because what is it that they believe? Do they believe about social justice, or do they believe about Israel?
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that, especially also when it comes to the message, right? As our guest there just mentioned, it's also about the message that is being given to American Jews, of course, about social justice, and that's an important element of Judaism, certainly. But then at the same time, it's that, you should support Israel, and I'm not saying blindly, certainly. I don't think is the message, but just that sort of criticism is not really then acceptable.
Yeah, I agree with your other guest that actually it's not really about policy. Policy is not going to change. The policy is set. The policy is to take over and have control over the entire land from the river to the sea. The question is how you sell it. And what Israel, for a long time, for the last 30 years, Israel has had a monopoly on the story that is told about that, which is around self-defense. And I think what's really interesting now, both with young Jews, but also with young Americans, is that story no longer is holding. The latest, in the latest attack on Gaza, it was very, very significant. that the dominant discourse is now breaking. It's not breaking on television. If you look at television and you look at the kind of the mainstream media, they are still telling the same story with the same representatives. You know, there's 3 Israelis for every Palestinian that's on there telling their story. Where they have lost control is on social media. And social media has now become so important that is breaking through into these numbers in public opinion, and Israel is very, very worried about this. And again, as one of your guests said, I think it's a generational issue, and I think more and more. There is this phrase in the United States. Actually, it's a phrase everywhere. You know, PEP, Progressive Accepts Palestine, and that is now becoming explicit. You can no longer, have progressive views on everything except Palestine and think you can get away with it, because you will be called out on it by a lot of people. And so that debate, that progressive except Palestine, is now becoming something that young Jews especially have to deal with, and especially, and as you mentioned. The Black Lives Matter movement has, since Ferguson, but well before that, there's always been a connection between Black liberation and Palestinian liberation. And since Ferguson, that has now just become absolutely clear. And so for Israel, and actually for the United States elites, this is a real point of worry, because this is the first time in the time that I've been studying it that there is a significant crack in the discourse. It's not broken open, but there is now a crack in the discourse. This debate is going on now within the Democratic Party. It's going on within Congress. It's going on within media.
Atalia, I wanted to bring you back in because, again, the Israeli Diaspora Affairs Minister, Nachman Shai, he said that we may lose the U.S., right? So I think that might be a paraphrasing of what he may have specifically said, but nevertheless, that's the gist of what he said. And I wonder, what does that then mean then? I mean, in the hypothetical situation that Israel loses the U.S., as the minister there described, what does that then mean for Israel?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. So Nachman Shai is worried about losing the kind of impunity that the U.S. has enabled over now decades, whether it is in the kind of diplomatic realm, international law, the United Nations, the veto in the Security Council, and most critically, he is thinking, as I think he also highlighted in that conversation, that he's thinking about the memorandum of understanding regarding the military assistance of the U.S. to Israel, and so the current MOU, the memorandum of understanding, will expire in 2026. So that phrase, that kind of bombastic phrase, will lose the U.S., means we are going to lose that kind of patronage, like imperial patronage, the impunity that the U.S. has enabled. If the U.S. will stop enabling the Israeli policies and, like your other guest said, kind of an annexationist framework, it will continue because there is no price, no consequences for more and more annexation, more and more land grab that is happening every day beyond the the horrific assaults on Gaza that kind of make it to the mainstream media. So this is what he's kind of like alarmist. He's reaching out to an ethos of American Jews about the importance of Israel as support of Israel, no matter what. Even though, yes, he said, yes, you may be critical of this and that, but there is a sense of, keep your criticisms to like kind of the dinner table, but we need to enhance the kind of support and challenge that erosion that happens very much, like your other guest said, because of the kind of the loss of the message to social media, to those alternative narratives. So So this is very much at the heart of it. And I think that נחמן Shai, and this is something very important to highlight, he is trying to juxtapose himself to what I believe Gilad Erdan, the former ambassador, said relatively recently, that Israel needs to kind of just forget about the American Jews. They are lost cause. They are all kind of being inclined to move toward support of BDS, or at least critical of the occupation and so forth. And we need to just devote all our hasbara mechanisms, all the kind of the propaganda, the messaging efforts to evangelical Christians, because this is what has been kind of the strategy.
Atalia, I'm going to cut you off because I actually want to ask about that, but we're quickly running out of time, so I do apologize for interrupting you, but I wanted to give Hasia and Asad time for final comments. Hasia, I wanted to ask you, in fact, about that point that Atalia there just made about Ron Dermer saying that, that Israel should then, concentrate its efforts on evangelical Christians, which in his words are the backbone of Israel's support in the U.S. He has a fair point in that regard, doesn't he?
Yeah, he has a fair point, but it's, again, I think a very dangerous one from a point of view of my opinion, that as younger American Jews begin to question why their politics, why their connection to Judaism seems to be framed around support for Israel. And in fact, I think there's very little space for dissent within synagogues, within the denominational bodies. So if American Jews are told you can't dissent on this, again, the younger ones are going to say, okay, too bad, we're going to break off and form our own organizations like If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace and so on, then Israel is essentially stuck with the evangelicals. And that comes with quite a price tag. And again, it makes sense for Israel to do that, but I would think policymakers would need to assess, what does that mean if we are the ones who are initiating this break? Because I don't predict, I mean, a historian should never make predictions, but I don't predict that American Jews, the young people, are going to disconnect from social justice movements like Black Lives Matter.
Indeed. Seth, I'll give you the final word then. On that point then of a shift in who then Israel seeks to work with in the United States, and I mean more evangelical Christians than American Jews, especially the younger ones, would that be, a seismic shift? I mean, I think that's probably the case that's right now anyways, isn't it?
I don't think there's that much difference. I mean, the evangelicals are the kind of core of that, which of course is very ironic. Like they're the most anti-Semitic group in the country. You remember when Armageddon comes, unless Jews convert, they will be banished to hell immediately. So the most anti-Semitic group in the country is what Israel is now relying upon, and evangelicals have no great commitment to Jews. They have a commitment to their vision of of the Bible. So that's a very, very, very dangerous position to take, I think, for Israel. But in terms of what they have to do, they have to lock down Congress, which they still have. They have to lock down the military-industrial complex, which they still do. So as I said, what we're seeing here is a crack in the discourse on the edges, but the main edifice still remains. And I don't see that changing very much in the future. The only thing I think that will that has possibility of change is if American elites, military and political elites, ask the question, what are we getting for our support from Israel? Is there more negativity coming from that? Is it a negative rather than a positive? And I think that question is starting to be asked now.
We're going to leave there as a final word, but we really appreciate all three of our guests for taking their time out of their busy schedules to share their thoughts with us. Seth was speaking to us from Northampton, Massachusetts. Hasia was speaking to us from New York, and Atalia was speaking to us today from South Bend. We discussed there, American Jews and their differing or slowly differing opinions now on Israel, and certainly there's a wide range of opinions on Israel within this group. So it's not like it's every single person who's changed their mind now towards Israel. But yes, as our guest mentioned, especially the younger generation has, because, as Hasia beautifully put it, they've been taught that social justice is extremely important, which it certainly is within Judaism, as in with many of the other religions of the world as well. So then if they're taught social justice is important, then they support BLM, but then Israel says don't support BLM because then that in some ways then leads to criticism of Israel and or, questions at least asked about its actions in the occupied territories, and Israel doesn't want that. Is it time for Israel to change tact and concentrate on evangelical Christians? Is that where its future, so to speak, lies? It has, as Sattar just mentioned, control of the chambers of power for now, but for how much longer? That is an open question. I'll leave it for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.